In the winter of 2003, the most successful young rider in the world made a decision that many believed would end his career at its peak. His name was Valentino Rossi, a boy from the small Italian town of Tavullia, who had risen through the smaller classes and then conquered the premier category with a swagger the sport had never quite seen before. He had won everything on the mighty Honda, a machine so dominant that people whispered it was the bike, and not the man, that carried him to victory. And Rossi, who could not bear such a whisper, chose to prove them wrong. He walked away from the finest motorcycle on the grid and signed for Yamaha, a manufacturer that had not tasted the top step in years, riding a machine that was, by every measure, slower. To understand what he was attempting, you must understand the stakes, for no rider had ever won back-to-back championships after switching between two rival Japanese giants. The first race of the new season waited in the heat of South Africa, on a high plateau circuit called WELKOM, and there the entire motorcycling world would learn whether the doubters had been right all along. The mountain circuit of Fakisa Freeway sat high above sea level, where the thin air robbed the engines of their breath and punished any machine already lacking power. And the Yamaha, that winter, had been lacking a great deal. When Rossi first threw a leg over the M1, he found a motorcycle that would not turn as he wished, that shook its head under braking, that felt a full step behind the red machine he had abandoned. Yet in the months that followed, working alongside his trusted crew chief Jeremy Burgess, he poured himself into transforming it, corner by corner, session by session, until the bike began to bend to his will. By the time the paddock gathered under the African sky, something extraordinary had happened. In qualifying, Valentino Rossi put that supposedly slower Yamaha on pole position. But a single fast lap is one thing, and a full race distance against Honda and the fearsome Max Biaggi quite another, and everyone in that paddock knew the true test would come on Sunday afternoon. Sunday came, and with it a tension you could almost taste in the thin mountain air. For this was no ordinary rivalry. Rossi and Max Biaggi had loathed one another for years. Two Italians who could not stand to share a country, let alone a racetrack. And now fate had lined them up together at the front of the grid. The lights went out, and in those first frantic corners, it was Biaggi on the Honda who surged ahead, that very machine Rossi had walked away from, roaring past to lead the race and seeming for a cruel moment to prove every doubter right. Rossi settled in behind, watching, measuring, refusing to panic, letting the laps unwind as he studied his enemy's every line. He knew the Yamaha could not simply overpower the Honda on that high plateau. If he was to win, he would have to do it with cunning, with patience, and with the kind of nerve that separates the great from the merely gifted. So he waited, lap after lap, tucked into the slipstream of the blue and white Honda, feeling out the Yamaha's strengths and hiding its weaknesses. Where Biaggi's machine pulled hardest on the long straights, Rossi found his answer in the corners, carrying speed through the turns, dancing on the very edge of adhesion. And then, with the race approaching its climax, he struck. A move of pure precision, a dive up the inside, and suddenly the Yamaha was ahead, the Honda scrambling in its wake. Biaggi fought back, of course. This was the enemy he had waited his whole career to beat, and neither man would surrender an inch. But Rossi held firm, riding those final laps with the calm of a man who had already decided how this story would end. He crossed the line first, and in a single afternoon, high on that African plateau, he had done the impossible. He had taken a Yamaha that had not won in years, a machine written off by its own paddock, and beaten Honda at the very first attempt. What happened next has passed into legend. Rossi guided the bike off the racing line, brought it to a halt, and simply sat there for a moment, alone, resting his head against the fuel tank as the enormity of it washed over him. He was thanking the machine, some said. Others swore he was speaking to it, sharing a private word with the partner that had carried him to the impossible. And when he finally rose, the emotion poured out of him, a man overwhelmed by what he and this blue Yamaha had achieved together against every expectation on earth. It was more than a race won. It was a statement, carved into the record forever. For that statement echoed far beyond the finish line at WELKOM, far beyond a single Sunday in South Africa. It shattered a myth that had hardened into gospel across the paddock. The belief that the rider was merely a passenger, that the machine made the champion and not the other way around. Rossi proved otherwise, and he proved it in the most brutal fashion imaginable, by leaving the greatest bike on the grid and beating it on his very first outing with a rival. No one had ever done such a thing. No one has truly matched it since. In one afternoon, he transformed the Yamaha from an also-ran into a title contender, and himself from a great champion into something closer to a legend of the sport. The doubters fell silent. The genius, it turned out, had never been in the engine bay at all. It had always been in the man. And so the season unfurled from that single seismic afternoon on the High Veld. For what began as a gamble, a leap into the unknown that half the paddock had branded madness, hardened week by week into a genuine assault on the world title. As Rossi and that blue machine grew ever more inseparable, ever more dangerous, at circuit after circuit across the calendar, Le Mans, Barcelona, Assen, the Cathedral of Speed. Everywhere the story was the same, a rider dragging a bike toward heights it had no right to reach, and doing it with a smile that never seemed to leave his face. By the year's end, the arithmetic was complete, and Valentino Rossi stood once more as champion of the world, now on Yamaha, having answered every question the sport could throw at him. It remains, to this day, one of the greatest single seasons ever ridden. Yet to understand the true weight of that title, you must understand what it cost and what it settled. For years, the whispers had followed him, that Honda had built the machine that built the champion, that any capable rider could have done the same aboard such a bike. With one season on the Yamaha, he silenced them all. He had walked away from the most successful motorcycle on the grid and beaten it, not by luck, not by fortune, but by the sheer force of a rider who refused to believe the machine mattered more than the man behind the bars. That, in the end, was the real victory. Not the trophy, not the numbers, but the proof, written across an entire calendar, that greatness is not manufactured in a factory. It is carried lap after lap in the heart and the hands of the one brave enough to chase it. And so the legend of that year settled into the marrow of the sport, spoken of in workshops and grandstands wherever motorcycles are raced. But the man himself was not finished. He would defend that Yamaha crown the following season and gather more titles still, adding chapter upon chapter to a story that had already outgrown any single team, any single machine, any single era. Yet the seed of all of it, the moment everything turned, remained that lonely afternoon on the High Veld of WELKOM, a gamble that became a coronation. For in the years that followed, whenever young riders asked what it truly meant to believe in yourself against all reason, there was only ever one answer, and it wore the number 46. The doctor had made his diagnosis, and the whole world had learned to listen. And what a diagnosis it had been! Consider, for a moment, the sheer improbability of what unfolded that first afternoon in South Africa, when a rider stepped from a championship-winning Honda onto a Yamaha that had not won a single race the year before, and led it across the line before the season had drawn its first full breath. No one had ever done such a thing. Not Agostini, not Halewood, not any of the immortals whose names are carved into the bedrock of the sport. To take a beaten machine and, on the very first attempt, wring victory from it against the men and the metal that had ruled the year before, that was a feat without precedent. It rewrote what the paddock believed was possible, for the story of WELKOM was never really about a single Grand Prix. It was about the redrawing of a line that everyone had assumed was fixed, the line between what the man brings and what the machine provides. And when the dust of that high plateau finally settled, the answer was written plain for all to read, in the hands and in the heart of the one who wore the number 46.